is U.S. deterrence in Asia failing? Why are people saying that it might be? And what do you think about that?
Yeah, it's good to be here. By the way, thank you all who I can't see for watching. I think there's a couple tiers of Asian states. There's Taiwan, and then there's everybody else. And Taiwan has serious problems when it comes to its defensibility and the believability even of U.S. deterrent threats. And there's everybody else who are quite safe. And so there's a general kind of mood in Washington, as reflected in articles by people like John Mearsheimer, even and Michelle Flournoy, in a less sophisticated academic way, who make the argument that U.S. deterrence is failing because of China's rise, because of its ability, especially to hit U.S. ships and aircraft with accurate missiles. And I wrote an article a few years ago with Ania Gyoza, who worked here at Defense Priorities, and with Eugene Galtz, professor at Notre Dame, called Defensive Defense, about a better way of defending allies, which really made the argument that we can defend allies at much lower cost and with much lower risk in terms of getting into a security dilemma with China and spending lots of money that we don't need to if we adopt this approach, which involves not planning to hit all these Chinese military forces in China in the event of a war, which we view as overly escalatory and dangerous, but rather pulling U.S. forces back physically from China's coast, where we're in a sort of a bubble of A2AD systems, where its radars can accurately track U.S. forces and cue missiles that can hit us and fight from longer range, and encourage our allies to develop the same kind of A2AD systems that the Chinese have. And it's not that our allies don't do this. It's not that they don't have area denial, anti-access capability, or anti-access area denial capability, A2AD. They do, but they should do way more of it. Taiwan in particular should invest way more, we argue, in mobile anti-ship missiles, mobile because it's harder to target that way. And they produce them themselves. And we say, look, we should give, instead of a lot of the military spending we have, we should just give Taiwan money if necessary it would be a better investment for us to just buy these systems. And we think U.S. allies should stop impersonating the United States in the sense of trying to build, and Taiwan's not an ally, I should say, but countries like Taiwan that rely on U.S. defenses and actual treaty allies like Japan and the Philippines should build systems that make it easier for them at lower cost to defend against an amphibious assault. So, summing it up, the United States has a status quo, pro-status quo strategy in Asia. We defend the territorial status quo. That's a defensive strategy, but we now serve that defensive strategy with offensive doctrine. We want to have a defensive doctrine to serve our defensive strategy and rely more on our allies to develop their own capabilities to defend themselves and be a more distant offshore balancer.
Awesome. You also mentioned a lot Taiwan specifically, and I just wanted to follow up on that with the question of, like, first of all, I guess it might be a two-parter. Is Taiwan really a defensible, like, from their own position, or is it a defensible place? And second of all, how badly do they have to want it for it to be something that's strongly defensible? Because I mean, that has to be a question, right? Is Taiwan themselves extremely dedicated to their own independence from China?
Yeah. Well, something I should add, I guess, is that I'm not just basing my answers on my own writing. I'm basing them on stuff that people here at Defense Priorities are doing. Lyle Goldstein is our new director of Asian engagement, we call it, and he's writing a series of papers that I'm the editor of, basically, on the defensibility of Taiwan, and ultimately he'll be talking about the defensibility of Japan, which is a much more defensible. And we have a paper by a guy named Mike Sweeney that's about the military utility of Taiwan to China in the event that they conquer it? What good will it do them? He says a little, but not that much. And we even have another paper about by a guy named Peter Harris about the non-military ways to deter an invasion of Taiwan. So I just wanted to mention all that. But a lot depends on the will to fight in Taiwan, and I don't think that should be taken for granted. I mean, one thing is I'm generally not in the habit of telling countries how much to spend on defense. I generally think the United States should do less to defend its allies, and then they should make their own decisions about how much to spend on defense. But Taiwan's an exception where I think where its defense spending as a percentage of GDP, which I think is about 2.5%, seems woefully inadequate given the threat it faces, growing threat it faces from China. And it seems to me they should be more like Israel, 6-7% or 10% even would make sense if they're really that committed to their independence. And their politics are not that straightforward, though. And I think some of it reflects ambivalence in the population about how the relationship with China they want to have. It's not everyone there is a Taiwanese nationalist who doesn't want to be part of China. And there's also unclear will to fight. So, a lot of, we recommend the Taiwanese do all this stuff, build better AD systems, pave a lot of the island basically so that it's a highway that they could have mobile missiles on. But maybe they don't want to do that. And, they have nice beaches and waterfront properties that they could put a bunch of defenses on. But for sort of aesthetic and environmental reasons, they might not want to do that, and that's their choice. But then it's sort of an odd situation where the United States is stuck being a more adamant defender of Taiwan than in some ways the Taiwanese are. So, I think it's an open question how much they want to fight. But they have one big advantage, which is that they're an island, and it's not a small island. I think Taiwan's about the size of New Hampshire plus a half. And so, you can put a lot of defenses on there. So, man-made islands that China wants to create are terrifically vulnerable to U.S. countermeasures because they're so small. We can find all the radars and so forth on there. Taiwan can hide a lot of stuff. They can use the fact that it's mountainous. Taiwan's mostly mountainous to hide defensive systems. They can use cover. And amphibious landings are just really hard. And modern military technologies, these A2AD systems that I'm talking about, which is really just the ability to marry a missile to a radar system and accurately target things, are deadly for ships. They're deadly for ships because ships are big metal objects in the water that you just can't really disguise. And then there's mines and other things that make amphibious landings hard. But there's a reason why why warfare has seen so few amphibious landings since the early part of the 20th century, and it's incredibly deadly. That doesn't mean they can't work. Normandy was deadly but successful, and the Normandy invasion. And I think the analysis I've seen says, look, the people argue about this, but the Chinese can do it. Let's leave the United States out of it. The United States doesn't fight for Taiwan. The Chinese will probably be able to take Taiwan. Depends a lot on the assumptions you make, but they'll take very heavy losses. They might, depending on how hard the Taiwanese fight, the Chinese will hit them with a bunch of missiles. They'll try to knock everything down in Taiwan that can move or roll and try to sap their will. But if they're motivated and if they do a decent job and have some warning from intelligence, then they should be able to have most of their defensive systems survive that initial missile onslaught. And then they can hurt the Chinese attackers badly because all those ships are vulnerable. And it sort of becomes a question of how many accurate anti-ship missiles do you have versus how many ships they have. They can hurt them badly. And if the Chinese try to use aircraft or helicopters to insert people, which some people think they'll do, they'll get hurt even worse because, then you're vulnerable to all kind of ground fires. But there's a lot, the PLA is really big. And if they can use non-military ships, which are inherently even more vulnerable, they can bring even more people across. And it's just sort of a question of how many people do you want to get killed in the operation. And if you want to get enough people killed, if the Chinese are willing to take 30% casualties, again, leaving out the United States participation, which complicates things, they could do it. So, I think the big question is, how motivated are the Chinese? How motivated are the Taiwanese to fight back? We know the Chinese are motivated, but are they motivated like taking 30% casualties level motivated? And what do they expect about U.S. participation, and how many submarines in particular can the United States get up into the fight before it's over? And can the Taiwanese hold the Chinese off long enough for all these U.S. military assets, which are pretty far away, to get into the fight and then really make a difference? And, I think the ideal scenario for China is the Taiwanese get knocked down and it's all over so fast that, only a few U.S. submarines get on scene to start knocking out Chinese shipping across the strait.
Yeah, so to follow up on that, I've been looking at the new book, from last year by Elbridge Colby, called Strategy of Denial, which is basically about this kind of problem, in particular, the defense of Taiwan. And he offers a fairly similar picture of, what the battlefield dynamics look like. But his whole argument, at least as I read it, hinges on a particular assumption, namely that if Taiwan falls, that this could lead to a kind of unraveling of the U.S. alliance system in East Asia, and really open the door for Chinese hegemony in Asia. In particular, he's arguing that China's best strategy is to pick on individual separate states at one time, rather than, kind of going after everybody at once. That Taiwan is a really easy target, that, a relatively easy target, and that, the other states in the region look to the U.S. commitment to Taiwan, even though it's not formalized as an alliance, as a bellwether for the region. And that thereby, if Taiwan falls, that there's a severe danger of Chinese hegemony in Asia, probably without even too much more fighting, because a lot of states would start to accommodate the Chinese. What do you make of that kind of argument?
It's wrong. It's aggressively wrong. And here's why. Okay, so there's the sort of political side of it, and then there's the military side of it. They're linked, of course, but number one, it would be, even in a best case scenario for China, it would be expensive to occupy and pacify Taiwan, at least for a while. They're going to have to bring in a lot of security forces into Taiwan to make sure there's not continued rebellion. And that's going to be costly. It's very unlikely that from some sort of economic standpoint, that they're going to get more benefit out of sort of taking over the Taiwanese economy, which they already trade heavily with, than they do than the cost of occupying it. So it's a losing, I think, at least in the short term, it's a heavily losing economic proposition. Of course, then there are the costs of the invasion itself, which could be hairy. So in that sense, it's more like an indigestion problem that China has than some sort of, like an energy bar that kind of propels you into greater conquest. And I think, it's important to think about the way conquest works. We have these analogies from World War II in our mind, where you sort of take over the industry, then you put it into military might, and then off you go. But I don't think Taiwan would work that way. I think it would be, at least in the short term, again, difficult for China to occupy it. More importantly, the way Asian states would react to that would, I think, be balancing, not bandwagoning, in the sense that they're more likely, and you already see some of this now with Australia and the AUKUS deal and other things, the more aggressive China is, and conquering Taiwan would sure be a sign of aggression. I think the more those countries are likely to spend more on their militaries, and particularly the submarines and things like that are best suited to dealing with China. And they're even more likely to ally among themselves. It's a debate right now in Japan whether or not they would help the United States and Taiwan in the event that China attacked them. I think it's unlikely, but it's possible. But after China swallowed Taiwan, I think the Japanese pacifism, such as it is, would take a hit, and they'd spend more on their military, and that would be a negative result for China, not positive. The Australians would probably tie their arms or link their arms more closely with Asian states. You'd see heavier military spending in places like probably the Philippines and Vietnam, and some smattering of alliance type moves. So, but I think the limits of the balancing would be due to the fact that the military side of things, which is, I don't think Taiwan's worth that much to China militarily. I was just reading a paper about this today, the Mike Sweeney paper I mentioned. I was editing it. And he makes some good arguments in there, or he gets into detail about a few things. One of which is the biggest advantage that China would get from Taiwan is the radar systems they could put on there, because then their A2AD systems, which are limited by the range of radar. It's a technical issue, but they're limited by the range of radar. It's 400 or 500 kilometers, could look out a little further. That means they could target U.S. ships accurately a little further, U.S. aircraft. They could raise radars higher in the Taiwanese mountains and get a little further than that. And so that would help China. And there's a good port there, and their submarines, their diesel submarines, which have limited range, would have greater range as a result of being based in Taiwan. But the bottom line is that none of that stuff would really get them very close to being able to conquer Japan, or even relevant parts of Japan. When Chinese, even with Taiwan, when Chinese military assets heading that way towards Japan or other places in the Pacific Ocean, they lose these home field advantages they have from A2AD systems. They get out of range of the radars that allow them to accurately target U.S. ships, and they get in range sooner or later of other people's radars that allow their ships to be accurately targeted. So they go from being the defender who has these inherent geographic advantages to being the offensive party that suffers from defenders' advantages. And so that's why in this paper, this is a Eugene Galt's term that we use in the paper, or actually it comes from other people. But anyway, no man's sea. The term is no man's sea. The East and South China Sea should become, if the United States has something to do about it, no man's seas, and it's hard to go in either direction. So that I think would remain the case if China conquered Taiwan. And so as bad as that would be for the people of Taiwan, all 23 million of them, I don't think it would make a great deal of difference for the balance of power across the Pacific Ocean. And in fact, because of the indigestion problems it might give China, it might actually aid the US side of the balance of power, the Asian allies side against China of the balance of power.
And you mentioned that you don't think Taiwan is not a lot of a military asset to China. So I was wondering, what exactly does their interest consist in? Because I think that probably tells us how much they're willing to give for it, right? Like, is it historical, like in the sense that it's a historical rivalry? Like, is it economic? What are the main interests that they would have in actually conquering Taiwan?
Well, I'm not a historian, let alone of East Asia, I should say. But I don't think China doesn't want Taiwan because it's a great base for further power projection into East Asia. I mean, I'm sure they wouldn't mind that. And it also can interrupt shipping from there was the other part I didn't mention. But they could do that already from their coast, but they could do it in a more effective way from Taiwan. But they want it for historical cultural reasons, which is that they view it as part of their country. And that is the issue between China and Taiwan, that both sides, particularly China, say it's one China, we're it, and they want to unify. They view it as an outlaw province that they want to bring back into the fold. That's the issue, and and I think it gets lost in the Graham Allison Thucydides trap stuff, rising power. China's the rising power and the U.S. is the status quo power, and John Mearsheimer stuff that says China's bound for, to try to become a regional hegemon. I don't think they have a great desire to go other places in terms of being politically dominant, let alone conquest. They want to assert themselves more. That's clear, but that is consistent with their growing power. But I don't think they're bound for regional hegemony in the sense of conquest, like some Napoleonic binge. I don't see that. I think that they want Taiwan, and I think we don't need to have a new Cold War if we can find a way of muddling through vis-a-vis Taiwan. That's the thing. It's not about, I don't think it's about relative GDPs. I think it's more or less largely about at least Taiwan. And a bit like in the beginning of the Cold War, where the real issue was Germany and how Germany would function in Europe, and the Soviets' fears of what would happen if Germany rearmed, particularly if it got nuclear weapons. That was the driving force of the Cold War early on. And of course, later China and Asia got involved, but it wasn't necessarily that there were these two big powers. And to the extent it was largely because of the geography of Europe that made it much harder to avoid security dilemma type dynamics and pacify relations. Whereas in Asia, East Asia, Robert Ross said, Asia, who's a professor at BC, said, Asia has a geography of peace. And that's true, because Taiwan is too close to China for its own good, but it's still got these 100 kilometers of water between it and China. That makes it harder for China to invade Taiwan. And that's good for defense, which is good for peace. And Japan is far away. That's good for defense, good for peace. In the other direction, you got mountains and the Himalayan mountains between China and India, and that's good for pacifying relations, although obviously with some clashes, it doesn't totally do the trick. And you have Russia over there with nuclear weapons. So I want to argue with John Mearsheimer more and say, where exactly do you think they're going, China? Beyond Taiwan, I see that, but where are they headed beyond that? I don't think anywhere.
So you mentioned Europe and the contrast between Europe and Asia, and that kind of gets to something that I always think about. Because I agree with your assessment that hey, defense is dominant in a lot of these situations, and it seems like a lot of the technological trends are amplifying that. But I keep thinking back to 1940, where it sure seemed like defense was dominant. The most recent big war, in World War I, had seen defense heavily dominant in Europe, and the two sides had really struggled to break through each other. And then the French, kind of built their war plan somewhat around that, and ended up being deadly wrong and collapsing as a power, throwing off the entire balance of Europe. And so I always wonder, how confident can we be in our assessments of offense-defense balance, given that the costs, at least in that case, were pretty high?
Yeah, and I mean, there is this whole school of thought which comes from the University of Chicago. John Mearsheimer's sort of famously skeptical about the utility of offense-defense theory, and his student Keir Lieber, who's now, for a long time a professor at Georgetown, wrote a whole book about how offense-defense theory is wrong, and largely saying what you said, that we think we have one read on it, and we turn out to be wrong. And I guess there's a lot to say about that, but one thing is, I think the technological side of it is the hardest to call, and it's the hardest to call across land. But the geography aiding the defender, I think, is a pretty historically, empirically sound thing. And the difficulty that I mentioned already of amphibious assaults is something we have a lot of evidence of, although, like I said, people don't do it lately, I think because it's so deadly. We can look at, there aren't that many interstate wars, happily, for us to collect a lot of good historical precedents on this lately. But there are amphibious landings in the past, and we can look at the accuracy of missile systems and say, cruise missile can hit a ship pretty easily. I mean, a lot more and more states have the ability to do that. So if you got a bunch of ships coming across the water, you count the cruise missiles that are aimed at your ship, and at least the cruise missiles left after you do your air assault, and those are probably going to hit your ships. I mean, there's a good chance if it's a halfway capable military. Ballistic missiles are more difficult at hitting a moving target for various reasons, but everybody talks about China's ballistic missiles, DF-21, DF-26, but I think it's the accuracy of those against moving targets against ships is still a question. Anyway, so it's possible we could be wrong, but the other thing is, what's the alternative? Figure out a really offensive military posture against China. I mean, that seems it's a whole nother conversation, but that seems basically infeasible to me. So, shoring up the defenses of our allies, seems like a pretty safe way to invest money, even if we don't have a perfect read on the technology. Right? Largely because in the United States, it doesn't have to be our fight. So, I think we should limit our liability in a way. It doesn't mean abandoning our allies entirely, although, I think that should always be under consideration. It's not because it's politically impossible, but, we ought to limit our risk and sort of say, look, even if China attacks somebody, let's limit the chances that this winds up being World War III. That seems like a good policy to me.
I'm going to work in a few of questions from the audience here. Ethan says, given the defense dominance of amphibious situations like Taiwan, how comfortable can the U.S. be that China will effectively telegraph its move on Taiwan beforehand by ramping up ship production and moving defense articles to the area of the mainland across the strait? It seems they have to throw so much metal and so many bodies at Taiwan that we would be able to pick up some signals with confidence.
I think so. I think that the warning will be good. Not everybody agrees. With regard to a missile salvo, you're going to have less warning. I mean, the United States has early warning radar satellites that will pick up launches, but that only gives you however long it takes a missile to go 100 kilometers. So, that's not very long. That's like minutes, not hours, not days. But the question is, I guess, is the Chinese just do a bolt from the blue missile strike and then pull their their shipping together after that? And I kind of think that's unlikely. And I also think it's unlikely that they will just attack Taiwan a bolt from the blue without some kind of crisis or series of an escalating political crisis, sort of like what we see now with Ukraine. And that's a judgment that could be wrong, but I think there'll be sort of political warning and at least some logistical moves that should allow the Taiwanese to, sort of button down the hatches a bit. Whether or not that does them enough good to make a difference, I don't know. But I think they should have warning.
So we've got another question. And by the way, for those of you listening in, we've got the Q&A feature down at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to ask questions yourself or to upvote questions from others that you'd like to see answered. I'm going to turn to one from Jake Rotter, who asks, if action were to be taken against Taiwan, what do you view as the natural next steps from the U.S. point of view, were we to act based on our current posture? And how strongly would those actions rely on U.S., ROK, Japan, trilateralism?
Well, I think our current posture is strategic ambiguity. So the whole point is that we can't really say, are we going to fight or not? So it's a bit of a dead end saying, what are we going to do based on our current posture? That being said, what do I think we would do? I think we would not fight. Who knows for sure? There would be a heavy debate in the Biden administration in the United States in that event. But if I were president, I'd say I didn't want to go to war with China over Taiwan. I like Taiwan. I wish it all the best. But at the end of the day, we're not going to fight. The reason being partly that it could escalate to a nuclear war. This all takes place in the shadow of nuclear weapons. China has a secure second strike capability. They seem eager, by the way, to make sure they really do, or that at least they've convinced even the most hawkish people in the United States they do with the nuclear buildup. They're building hundreds of new nuclear weapons for some reason. ICBMs, which are in silo, they're building all these silos, which we think they'll fill with nuclear weapons. So I guess that's my answer.
Another question from the audience based upon this problem of Taiwan. Stuart asked, how would Taiwan respond to Chinese attempts at invading one or more of its outlying islands? Would this serve any strategic purpose for China? How would or should the U.S. respond to this type of Chinese strategy?
I should say, I meant to answer the other part of the question. It sort of lost my train of thought. So let me come back to that. But allies, what would we do? What would Korea and Japan do? Like I said before about Japan, it's an open question. I think it's more likely that the Australians would try to get into the fight than Japan. But at least if we're projecting out into the future a little bit, those submarines they ordered from us aren't going to be ready for a long time. But on the other hand, they're very far away. So, Australia is a different continent. I think Sydney is almost as far from the Chinese coast or from Taiwan as London. It's around similar distances. So it's not like it's around the corner. Anyway, so I don't think Taiwan can really count on anybody coming to their defense in the event that China attacks them. They sure want to count on us, and I think that's the best option. But like I already said, it seems unlikely. And by the way, I think having a little less confidence that we'll come to their defense might help spur them to do some of the more aggressive measures that will ultimately make them more secure. If they're a little more frightened that the United States is not actually in their corner, if they have to consider that. It's analogous in a way, I think, to Ukraine, which has relied on U.S. promises or vague U.S. promises or hints of future U.S. promises to its detriment. But anyway, if China takes outlying islands of Taiwan, I think it will open itself up to taking a lot of hits from Taiwanese defense systems and potentially U.S. defense systems without actually taking Taiwan proper. So I don't think there's really a good argument to be made for an island hopping campaign, because I haven't studied the geography closely, but I don't think you can take the outlying territories without getting into the thick of the defensive systems that Taiwan has, and thus you're going to be running all the risks and incurring a lot of the costs of an amphibious assault without taking the main goal. So that doesn't seem like a great strategy to me off the top of my head, but I should admit that I haven't studied it closely.
Another question. This is from Ryan Burkhaw, who says Japan is almost entirely dependent upon trade flows in the Taiwan and Luzon Straits. Chinese control over Taiwan would afford it disproportionate leverage over Tokyo. It has long been theorized that China's ideal scenario involves Finlandizing Japan, and Chinese officer training manuals even support this theory. Doesn't this make Japanese involvement in a Taiwan contingency a matter of strategic necessity for them?
No, I don't agree that they would have that much leverage over shipping in the event they took Taiwan. I think they would have more ability to disrupt shipping, but a lot of it comes down to where shipping between Japan and its trade partners go. I mean, most of the Japanese shipping that would be in those waters would be headed to China. And are they going to be holding their own shipping hostage to screw with Japan? And they don't need to sink it to do that. So I'm not convinced that they can threaten Japan into being Finlandized. And, more importantly, Japan is very defensible against China because it's far enough away and has enough military capability when it comes down to it that Chinese military would get absolutely chewed up if it ever tried to invade Japan. There's not very much controversy about that. I mean, the United States invests a great deal of money in defending Japan, and yet I don't really know anyone who thinks China has a real fighting chance of conquering Japan. They can maybe screw with, contested goat islands and things like maybe Okinawa, which is very well popular, but it's full of U.S. troops, so that would be a bad idea for them. So, the Japan is in pretty good shape, I think, vis-a-vis China. And if China, went after its shipping, it would be, I'm sure they could do some damage to the Japanese economy. But I don't think it's a really good read on Japan. I'm not, again, a Japan expert to say that they would sort of tuck their tails between their legs, tuck their tail between their legs and sort of say, okay, we agree to be Finlandized. But why, by the way, I mean, I find it hard to see why China would want to Finlandize Japan. They have a lot of historical animosity between them, but what exactly would they get out of that? I don't really see it. They trade with them now. They do okay that way. I don't see really any indication whatsoever that China wants to conquer Japan. They have a kind of, cultural security dilemma going on where they have a lot of animus, but conquest I don't see. And Finlandization, it's a little unclear to me it's not like Ukraine and Russia or Taiwan. I mean, Finlandizing Taiwan, sure, I could see that, but it's a different kettle of fish with Japan.
Jake has another question based upon Chinese and their a Chinese hegemony. He says, what purposes do you view the Belt and Road Initiative to serve? Do you think that the Belt and Road Initiative is a success at present, or its efforts the success of which remains to be seen?
Well, I mean, there are different ways of judging the success of the Belt and Road Initiative, one of which is influence. The other one is, they're making loans, right? There's a financial component to it, and whether or not, it's profitable in the sense of getting return on investment in a literal sense, I think it remains to be seen. There's reason to think that they're making bad loans that will not be profitable to them. There's a small literature developing about Chinese debt traps, and this idea that, they get these countries like Sri Lanka into these situations where they have to hand over property to the Chinese. And I think there's good reason to be skeptical that debt traps are really, what the Chinese think they're doing, and a likely scenario for many countries where they wind up sort of, as servants of China because of their debt. But generally, my view of the Belt and Road Initiative is that the Chinese economy has grown by leaps and bounds. They have a lot of cash, and it's not necessarily, it shouldn't be alarming to us that they want to invest it in their own near abroad, in their neighborhood for economic development. I mean, I suppose it's preferable that they make a bunch of sort of dubious loans to developing nations in their periphery rather than just plowing it all into the PLA and buying all the amphibious ships for whatever reason they haven't bought to conquer Taiwan, buying more aircraft carriers to go menace Japan, like we were talking about. I think there's a lot of bad ideas about Chinese economic investment floating around. And they're predicated on the idea that we're in some sort of global security struggle with China, where them gaining some degree of influence in developing countries comes at our expense. And I think that's just fundamentally wrong. And as it was the case in the Cold War, it really didn't matter in the Cold War to U.S. security if the Soviets had good relations or advisors or something in Angola or in other parts of the third world, just as it doesn't really matter very much from the standpoint of U.S. security right now if Russia has troops in Syria. It's not a prize that makes it easier for them to conquer parts of the Middle East that have a lot of oil in them and thus, make them into a bigger economic behemoth. No, it's a place with a civil war, very little oil, And it's more of a detriment than something that's going to be help you bound to geopolitical glory. And the same goes for most of the places China's investing money in the Belt and Road. But the Chinese investments don't necessarily inhibit U.S. security, even in more profitable places, because we have nuclear weapons and a big military, and we're sort of inherently secure in the United States. We don't need to fuss with a kind of global Cold War in the developing world. There may be other reasons to do it, but the argument that we're in a global security competition with China really, I think, bears little scrutiny.
So we've got a question from Sarah Caldwell, who asks, if the United States doesn't defend Taiwan, won't that damage their reputation with other countries in the region?
Well, to the extent they view themselves as analogous with Taiwan, yes, but they ought not to. I mean, we have no treaty alliance commitment to defend Taiwan. We have a policy of strategic ambiguity where we say we might defend them, and we have committed through the Taiwan Relations Act to help them acquire weapons to defend themselves. But that's very different than the agreement we have through treaties with Japan, with Australia, with South Korea. We say in the event of an attack on your territory, we will help you militarily, like the NATO treaty, Article 5. It's not like that. So it would be odd if Japan said we're just like Taiwan. I mean, would it make them, it wouldn't fill them with joy if the United States sat on its hands while China took Taiwan. They might get a little nervous. They might spend more money on defense as a result. But I don't think it would be sensible to read into it that the United States wouldn't defend them. Daryl Press's book about calculating credibility, I think, to me, is kind of the gold standard to think about this issue. There's a lot of good writing about credibility, most of it attacking the way people think about credibility in Washington. And Press's argument is that what makes threats credible? Deterrent threats, extended deterrence, or any threats? Well, it's interest and capability. Do we have an interest in fighting, and do we have the capability to act on it? If Japan thinks that we don't have an interest in fighting for them, then they should worry. But what we do vis-a-vis Taiwan shouldn't really impact that very much unless they think Taiwan's just like them. And so if we don't fight for Taiwan, that means, they must not have an interest in fighting for us. And as I already discussed, our capabilities to defend Japan are much more robust than our capabilities to defend Taiwan, because we don't have to go into the teeth of Chinese defensive systems on their coast to defend Japan. So, I don't think that our deterrent threats will be very negatively affected if we don't defend Taiwan.
And another question from the audience on that idea of deterrence. He says, if China has a limited desire or limited opportunity to be an expansionist power, this is from Steve, what then is the metric for measuring the effectiveness of our deterrence? Is it only preventing an attack on Taiwan, deterring them from island expansion in the South China Sea, or something else?
Well, I don't know what the metric, I mean, there's measuring the success of deterrence is really hard, so hard that political scientists fought about it for years. In a series of articles I had to read in graduate school. And the bottom line is it's really hard, because most of the time it appears that you're succeeding because wars are very rare. And, we tend to make deterrent commitments to states that have pretty good outlooks to begin with. So our deterrent threats are unlikely to be tested. So it's very hard, and metrics are difficult. Clearly, if China were to, just decide that it wants to go attack a bunch of U.S. allies, that would be a failure. But success is a little harder to judge. And but the bottom line that it gets to for me is that deterrence in Asia, because it has, as I said, a geography of peace, because defenders have major advantages, which modern technologies in terms of radar and accurate missiles are only improving. Deterrence is not brittle. Deterrence is not failing because it's not that hard. And add to that I think beyond Taiwan, which is a very important exception, beyond Taiwan, I don't think China has that many offensive aims. So our deterrence is in some ways overkill. There's some inherent stability baked into the equation in China. I'm sorry, in Asia, that these questions of is deterrence working or not ignore, and that's why I think that there's a sort of a cult of deterrence failure in Washington, because it's sort of boring, to say for 40 years in the Cold War. Actually, the truth is that the Soviets are pretty well deterred by NATO and U.S. nuclear weapons. And yeah, sure, they'd love to, reincorporate parts of or incorporate parts of Eastern Europe and further afield, but they're not about to risk World War III for it. So you can go back to sleep, essentially. And that's I think was essentially what happened after like the mid '60s. The Cold War was very stable. We were arguing about arms control and all these things, but the chances of an actual war happening were very low. And sadly, for a lot of people who are in the security studies business, the chances of an all-out war between the United States and China, even with Taiwan making it way more likely, remain very low because there's mutually assured destruction from nuclear weapons. So, it's great news ultimately that deterrence isn't so brittle. It's not that hard to deter states in the modern era, particularly if you're the United States.
So related to that, earlier you had mentioned strategic ambiguity, that we don't really make it clear whether we would go to war with China if China would attack Taiwan. And that policy has come under increasing criticism, essentially arguing that because China has more of an ability to threaten Taiwan than it did before, and more of an ability to impose costs on a U.S. military effort to support Taiwan than before, that the United States should explicitly declare its intention to defend Taiwan and thereby end strategic ambiguity. What do you think about that?
I think number one, you have Richard Haas wrote that, who's the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, and others. I think number one, as my former graduate school buddy Josh Rovner wrote, I think it was in War on the Rocks, strategic ambiguity is a fact more than a policy, in that, I think it's strategically ambiguous whether or not the United States would defend Lithuania, for example, which is a NATO ally, sadly, in terms of its indefensibility, but it's a NATO ally. So the United States is on paper committed to defend it. But would we really, if Russia decided to roll into Lithuania, would we decide we're going to start, World War III, potentially goes nuclear for Lithuania? I don't know. I think it's a little ambiguous. I probably wouldn't if I was president. So likewise, even if the United States says it's going to defend Taiwan, China might not really believe us. And even if we say we're not going to defend Taiwan, they might not fully believe us. They might think, well, the next president might be Nikki Haley or Mike Pompeo, and then you guys might rush back into defending Taiwan. So it's ambiguity is kind of hard to get rid of, regardless of your declaratory policy. I think the danger of strategic clarity, as people like to put it, is that. I suppose it would make it a little more likely in China's head that we would actually defend Taiwan. They might say, you know what, let's nip this in the bud. And before the United States can make its commitment, its now clear commitment to defend Taiwan manifest, we're going to attack. To me, it's analogous to if the United States ever really said we were going to put Ukraine in NATO, like it was announced that we're for real going to put Ukraine in NATO, or Ukraine is in NATO, surprise vote, somehow Ukraine's in NATO. I think Russia would attack, at least more likely Russia would attack them the next day before we could defend it. And they would attempt to fait accompli and say, okay, before you can, make it likely that we actually can't take Ukraine, we're going to take the piece off the board. And you could see something similar, I think, happen with Taiwan. That's the danger, at least.
Yeah, and I just had a question about, essentially, obviously China in the past 20 years or whatever has obviously gone from a nation that doesn't really pose any significant threats to the United States or anybody around them to obviously immense both military and economic growth. Do you think that those past 20 years is a trend that will continue as far as their military strength and innovation? I mean, recently they had that hypersonic missile test, and do you think that like there's dangers of their do you think that their military is on a trend and their economic and military strength is on its trend continually up, or do you think that it's more likely to plateau? I guess I don't know if that's
well, I'm not gonna. I'm going to be a bit cowardly and just say, for starters, I don't know. I don't. Predicting the future is hard, or making predictions hard, especially about the future. Who said that? Yogi Berra or somebody. So I don't know. But look, like Chinese economic growth, it's driven by taking a very large number of people out of the countryside and putting them into much more productive and an economic sense. I don't know if they all feel that way. Much more productive economic uses, generating wealth creation and GDP growth of the like of which the world has never seen. And they can't pull that trick forever because they run out of people. So and their growth has been slowing down from sort of Herculean like 9% a year levels or whatever it was a few years ago to more pedestrian levels, which are still growing fast. And I think, that's likely to continue. The pace of growth will slow as they become a more mature economy. And they've always spent around, I think, 2% of GDP on defense. It's just that their GDP keeps growing, so their defense budget keeps growing. So that means that the pace of growth of their military budget will slow down, even though it will continue to grow. And in that sense, things are likely to normalize a bit, but it's still going to be growing, and they're still going to overtake the United States, most likely in terms of GDP. I mean, maybe their financial sector will collapse, and I've been hearing about all the bad debt in China for a long time, and I don't profess to be an expert on that, but yeah, I mean, maybe they'll have some sort of financial meltdown. I don't know, but hasn't happened yet. So I think it's more likely than not that they'll overtake us in terms of GDP, and at least for a while there before their population problems catch up to them. And they'll be the behemoth in Asia. But for reasons I already explained, I don't think that means that they will have the ability to go take over in a direct territorial sense a big swath of Asia. I don't think they'll take over hardly any of it besides Taiwan, which they're very clear about wanting. And I think that's good news. The world is not, and Asia is not one that makes it likely that they're going to sort of, do the old, as I said already, Napoleonic kind of, let's just go for broke here, the kind of Hitler run it, Eurasian hegemony that we're taught to think everybody just kind of does if they get enough power. I think there's reasons to think that's not going to happen.
So we've got time for one more question, which I'll go ahead and ask it. One of the arguments that floats around out there is that the Taiwanese semiconductor industry either is a reason that the United States should defend Taiwan, or you'll also hear arguments that in the event of an attack on Taiwan, the Taiwanese should tell the Chinese, we are going to destroy our semiconductor industry so that Taiwan would be worthless to China from that perspective. What do you make of those kinds of arguments about the role that the Taiwanese semiconductor industry plays in this?
Well, a good way for the United States to revive its domestic semiconductor industry is for China to conquer Taiwan and try to subsume that semiconductor industry, because there's a lot of energy in the United States that wants to decouple. We haven't really done much of it, but people talk about decoupling all the time, and there's a lot of economic nationalism, and it would be nice to have all those semiconductor jobs back. So I generally think it would be hard to build up an industry, but we would. And Eugene Galtz has a lot of good writing on this issue, the general issue of strategic industries. And the bottom line is that I think economies are much more flexible and adjustable than is the sort of conventional wisdom. And, there might be a problem I'm not saying we wouldn't get our hair mussed semiconductor wise, but I think that markets would adjust and we would still have semiconductors and we would still have all the nice technologies we have. Prices might go up and there might be a backlog for a little bit. But the idea that was expressed, and there was an article recently that came out in Parameters, and one of the articles is Peter Harris, who's visiting he's a non-resident fellow at Defense Priority. So I told this to him. I don't think it makes any sense that they would blow up their semiconductor industry for a couple different reasons. Well, first of all, it wouldn't stop China from invading them, the threat to do that, because I think that China, as I said, wants Taiwan for historical, cultural reasons. And sure, they would like the semiconductor industry intact when they get there. But I don't think it would be the thing that makes a difference in whether or not they attack Taiwan. Besides that, I think the semiconductor industry has a lot of expensive physical capital tied up in it. And that's why people get the idea that you can just blow it up. But the truth is that, like most modern industries, the real value in that industry is in people's heads, and the engineers and the people who know how to order components, and in the sort of knowledge base that allows this group of individuals to build technology and make semiconductors with that technology and then sell them. And you cannot blow up that knowledge unless you feel like murdering a lot of engineers, which I haven't heard people propose. So that's another reason why I just don't think that makes sense. I think, if you want to get creative and think about other ways that we could sort of do economic deterrence by punishment, I guess that's a term of art. You could take advantage of all this energy in the United States to decouple and say, in the event that China conquers Taiwan, we, the United States Congress, say, here's a law, it will be illegal to buy semiconductors from that island. That will be illegal. And so then, I don't think that will stop China, but it will at least be like a couple pounds on the scale that will make it a little less likely that they think this will pay off. And you can invest money in sort of trying to, move towards like sort of the preliminary steps in ramping up our semiconductor industry here. But I don't think that will work. But it seems a lot more realistic to me than just saying we're going to blow up their industry physically, or they'll blow it up.
All right. Well, that is all the time we have. Thank you very much to Ben Friedman of Defense Priorities and to Josiah Mill and our chapter at the King's College. We'll be back this time next week with Emma Ashford talking about the Ukraine crisis, which hopefully won't have gotten much worse in the interim. But thank you all and have a wonderful evening.